Hello and good evening. My name is Michael Brett Lavenstein. I am today reading my opinions and recording my video response to the week of October 26th, the article by Charles Cezi in 2003, The Dynamics of Racial Residential Segregation. Now, as always, I always like to read I always like to give my opinion of what I think the article is going to be about using my prior experience. And the title is The Dynamics of Dynamics of Racial Residential Segregation. I think this is my thoughts on the idea of racial residential segregation is it's definitely a huge problem in the fact that where you live can very much affect everything else in society, and and it can affect a person's whole entire life. Continuing, I first learned about how prevalent this issue is from the movie Raising a Son, which is based in 1960s, I believe, about a black family in Chicago moved to a white neighborhood, and the neighborhood was doing everything they could to get rid of the family, and it showed in the movie how the students or the people who moved in had better resources, more like closer to their house rather than where they were living before. And there was a huge difference between living in the white neighborhood, which most likely was, well, not most likely, but definitely was more well kept and everything because there were more resources available and there was more money due to systemic racism. That was even, still horrible today, but it was even worse in the 1960s. But it still is horrible today, and don't get me wrong. And it definitely exists, racial residential segregation. And on page 168, of this article was a very good quote that I quote: "Whether voluntary or involuntary, living in racially segregated neighborhoods has serious implications for the present and future mobility opportunities of those who are excluded from desirable areas. Where we live affects our proximity to good job opportunities, educational quality, and safety from crime, both as a victim and as a perpetrator, as well as the quality of our social networks." And that was from a source by Jargowski in 1996 and Wilson in 1987. And this is on page 168. My comments regarding this I agree completely that where we live affects our proximity to good job opportunities, because you're not going to find super great job opportunities if you're in an area where there's very poor housing, and because of that there's more crime, because poverty is linked to crime, because people need to get out of poverty, and if they don't have those good resources around them, then they are more likely to commit crimes. It's not an individual issue, but instead it is a systemic issue. And the schools around areas of poor areas are not going to receive the same or not receive the best resources compared to schools in more affluent areas. And also more affluent areas are going to have more safety from crime, but also there's going to be a big reduction in crime, like I said, because there's not as much poverty. The two are directly linked. And so there's a lot of intersectionality, I would say, between all that, as well as the quality of our social networks. You're most likely not going to meet someone high up in a career field who's making a lot of money if you're living in an area that's not as affluent. It's just basically privilege. Like if your family makes more money, then you're more likely to live in a more affluent area. And guess who else is going to live in a more affluent area? Someone else who makes really good money. And meeting them, you're going to have very good social networks. So it's very racialized, those areas, especially like there is a lot of like housing segregation. There are a lot of neighborhoods that are like racially segregated, that are late. It's all latent. Like you can't really see it, but once you look into it, it's definitely there. And on page 169, I also quote this: emphasizing the interaction of segregation and rising poverty also furthers our understanding of the inability of non-poor blacks to escape segregation and its consequences, despite increasing class segregation within black communities. And focusing on a black middle class exodus, they argue detracts attention from the devastating consequences of residential segregation for all blacks. I like to say all people of the black community, irrespective of socioeconomic status. This is found on page 169. And I found that very interesting. It's kind of a catch-22. If you're living in an area that isn't affluent, you're not going to make good social connections. You're not going to have good resources. You're not going to be able to go to school and get good grades, and because the teachers aren't going to be as quality, and it's just going to be a catch-22. Like you can't escape it. And also, on page 171, it says, in 29 U.S. metropolitan areas, including or containing 40% of the total black population, blacks experience extreme multidimensional and cumulative residential segregation. Black people are unique in this experience, which contrasts sharply with the limited and temporary segregation experienced by other groups. Hispanics and Asians are only moderately segregated from whites, although their levels of segregation and isolation are increasing as a result of continuous high-volume immigration since 1970s. And so I think immigration is good because it definitely reduces the margin of all white neighborhoods, and there's going to be more representation and overall more interaction in between the different ethnicities, which hopefully will lead to different or better opportunities for people who aren't a part of the white community or people who aren't white. So it'll be more fair for people of the black community, of the Asian community, and of the Hispanic community. But anyway, that makes up my video. Thank you so much. Again, this is for the week of October 26th. The article by C.C. Charles in 2003, The Dynamics of Racial Residential Segregation. Thank you so much for listening.